Hello and welcome to 52 Weeks. This week we're starting into Chapter 5, Housing. This housing chapter is very important because we're going to look at several factors to develop a long-term plan for housing. This is something that hasn't been in Harrisburg's focus for quite some time. It's been in the focus of developers and outside interests, and that's been the policy of following a market-driven process instead of assessing the needs from internal demographics as well as our overall history, development, understanding the aging of housing, the 4,700 housing units that are in distress, and understanding our population as a slow growth, and we have not grown. So these are all factors that come into this chapter. This chapter is really looking at the data behind some of these things that can help the city council members and the planning bureau and the Harrisburg Planning Commission all work together to have a future next decade of looking at how do we address housing needs in Harrisburg. It's extremely important for long-term sustainability. Again, looking at triple bottom line, focusing on people, place, and then economics. This chapter is broken down into several segments, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out in the weeks and how they get grouped. But overall, there's 6 sections. First, we're going to go through the introduction this week. The next section, number 2, is building typology. Number 3 is building statistics. That includes the demographics, the data, and cars and housing, how that relates. Number 4 is issues in housing, some of the long-term issues and what to deal with, and how to look at equitable housing and dignified housing. The observations is number 5, looking at all this, what could be done, and these are observations that are all from all the sub-consultants in the comp plan process that are providing input based on understanding the market, understanding the long-term growth, what things have happened in Harrisburg, all mixed together. And then essentially arriving at number 6 is the building blocks of Harrisburg. This is a housing strategy for Harrisburg, addressing what we're going to be talking about, deferred maintenance, and also understanding what the maintenance industry is in this concept within Chapter 5. So in this introduction, we're looking at where we are now as far as city living. Quote right out from the comp plan: Harrisburg's residential neighborhoods have been effectively complete for over 50 years. Thus, the primary focus of housing policy is the sustainable management of the city's extensive areas of contiguous historic housing stock. That means all the housing stock that's together, blocks that are together, mostly together, about 75% complete, understanding addressing that. Harrisburg's residential building stock is remarkably consistent in physical character due to the relatively small historical window during the 30-year boom period in which it was built. So here's a graph that looks at everything beyond 1939 and earlier. Much of the city visible today was built relatively quickly between 1880 and 1939, which resulted in strong, cohesive neighborhood character. The city's neighborhoods enjoyed a citywide system of parks, commercial core areas, and a very high-quality housing stock. So this is what our legacy that we have already as a city. That's what we should be continuing to build up and strengthen what was already placed before us. This is in the parks, the citywide park system, understanding land use. That's why that setup was there. All these other chapters, preceding chapters, lead into why do we live here? We've got to understand this legacy of what Harrisburg is as far as the built environment. So we have place, that's very important. We talked about placemaking and why that's important. So here we have that as placemaking, we live in this environment and our actions do affect each other. What we do on a block affects the rest of our neighbors, or in turn affects the city. We've got to understand this communal landscape that we live in as a city. This is what makes cities. We don't live out in the rural areas or in the suburbs where we're separated swaths of grass, separating properties that were pretty isolated. We're actually living in close proximity and density. In understanding this, the properly managed, the city's historic neighborhoods can evolve to be increasing valuable assets for many decades, if not centuries to come. This is where we're at now. We do enjoy our neighborhoods. If you look at parts of Allison Hill that have this strong neighborhood character to it as you wander around, this all fits together. Parts of Uptown, parts of Midtown, these are all related back to this legacy. Don't want to go and destroy this stuff or let it continue to deteriorate beyond repair. And that's where we're at. We're at this crux moment in understanding our city and what value there is already around us, and how do we live in this together and support each other in that. Unfortunately, much of Harrisburg's housing stock suffers from substantial deferred maintenance. Just some pictures of going through around the city that you can look at places in Harrisburg that have been left by the wayside. They have been mothballed well, and the idea is that they get turned into a shell people sit on these properties waiting for this next payout. This goes back to the transactional thinking. Oh, well, I'm not going to invest because it's going to take a substantial amount of investment for a return on investment to happen. Some of the apartments that are out there are absolutely horrible. That has to be into this mix of housing. We'll talk about that later. And just we got to bring up the quality of living here to be much better. So people have dignified living standards that we all can agree on for all people. So the term deferred maintenance, it's the practice of postponing maintenance activities such as repairs on both real property in order to save cost, meet budget funding levels, realign available budget monies. So this is what happens in real estate. This is a term right out of Wikipedia. And what happens when we get a building, someone gets a building, boards it up, gets it to its point where it's not going to fall apart structurally, but it's going to sit there and take up space. And what happens is either the city can be part of this process if they're in the redevelopment authority buying properties or vacant lands and sitting on them for years because there's no plan for them, or it could be a private investor that buys something thinking they're going to make a lot of money down the road. When Harrisburg hits it big, everybody's looking for this land gold rush. It's happening again. I said this. It's happening up in Camp Curtin. It's happening uptown. It's going to happen in Allison Hill, Midtown. We're not prepared for this as a residential community-based grassroots effort because what's going to happen is outside interests are going to continue to push in, and that's going to be where the conflicts and the frustrations occur for the next decade. So that's why policy needs to be put in place and how that's mitigated really well. We're not prepared for that. Our Harrisburg Planning Commission is not prepared for that. Our City Planning Bureau is not prepared for that. Our Redevelopment Authority is not prepared for it. Our Housing Authority is not prepared for it. And I would say our mayor or our city government is not prepared for it. Everybody's kind of scrambling. Even Tri-County Regional Planning Commission is not prepared for it. So recognizing that all these entities have their own agenda, we have to really understand what this deferred maintenance is as far as a concerned citizen point of view, whether you're a renter or a homeowner. We all are in this together. This is Harrisburg. This is us. So the cool thing about the Wikipedia has some really good points to consider on the topic of deferred maintenance. The failure to perform needed repairs could lead to asset deterioration and ultimately asset impairment. Generally, a policy of continued deferred maintenance may result in higher cost, asset failure, and in some cases, health and safety implications. So if we let something go, it's going to continue to fall apart and need long-term and higher cost fixes. So example for this that I found, flossing or taking care of one's teeth. If you're not brushing regularly and doing the maintenance, and you're not flossing regularly doing the maintenance, that could turn into a 10-year issue, whether you have cavities or need a root canal later on. So all these things are adding up. So it's the same thing with our assets that are around us in our community. So as concerned citizens, we should really look at what's around us and consider what is the detriment when there's something's deferred. If one of our neighbors or owners or just a building, and it's not even ours, that it's someone else's, which is fine, someone else's property. But how do we take care of that as residents? Because it affects my daily living that's there. So how do you increase that? Part of that discussion is in civic engagement, and that comes from K-12 education, is understanding what is our community, how do we interact in our community, what's the relationship between the spaces that I inhabit in a public realm versus the ones that I live in physically. Continue to look at the data that's out there. While the city's residential zoning acreage is only about 20% of the total amount of land in Harrisburg, more than 76% of buildings are residential. That's a huge amount to be considering. And then on the topic of taxes, what is our tax burden on the resident versus other buildings that are around here? We know that we have a tax issue here in Harrisburg of 50% essentially non-taxable land. So this is interesting, is we're already set up with this large area of residential, and how do we deal with that in our everyday lives and living here and choosing to live here. Thus, the concentration of deferred maintenance and vacancy in housing stock has a profound effect on the experience of the residential areas. So where we do, if it's 76% of residential areas, and that's where we do our living every day, wouldn't that be the best and the largest majority of folks that are here and should be pushing for better quality of life, dignified living for all? And we should be pushing on our government to have policies that focus on the needs of our residents. Reinvestment in existing housing stock is the single most important action to positively transform the experience of the city. So if we go through and look at what buildings have been renovated, some of this has been sadly a long process because the structures and mechanisms to do this is so difficult to go through getting the finances together, if it's grant funded, if it's subsidized federal, state grants, All this stuff takes time to organize, and it is not one entity. The problem in the past is it's always seen as a single entity or 2 or 3 entities that start to pull this together. We need a unified citywide policy that looks at this to kind of jumpstart what's happening. Now, that comes with a caveat. We don't do that in having no restrictions on this process, because we could have this whole thing flip where there's this huge influx of new housing, and who's making it, who's building it, and who's benefiting from it. So these things need to be balanced really well, and understanding the need for rentals versus homeowners. These are all ideas that need to be balanced and look at as from a long-term projected growth of the city through the next decade. Thank you for listening this week. We'll continue next week within Chapter 5, Housing. Take care. Thanks.